FTSE Portfolio Marketing Manager and PCB's organizer for this session. As always, I'm delighted to have you all here with us. In today's session, we will discuss on altered states, active shooter, and planning for the unthinkable. To tell us more about it, joining is Mr. Geary Sikich, who is a principal with Logical Management Systems Corporation, a consulting and executive education firm with a focus on enterprise risk management and issue analysis. During the presentation, feel free to write your questions and comments in the question box in the right-hand control panel, or you can use the raise hand function. We will then unmute you and you will have a chance to ask the question directly to Mr. Sikich. All of the other questions will be answered accordingly at the end of the presentation. Also, if you are aware of a topic that you would like to discuss and participants would benefit from, please feel free to write down your suggestions in the survey at the end of the webinar. We are strongly committed to providing our audience with updated and useful information. So please, Mr. Sikich, you may start the presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. The topic I'm going to talk about is being broadly termed active shooter. It actually is a little bit more than just the thought process of an active shooter. So the first slide here says, what would you do? And I've crossed out the W to look at it not so much as what would you do, but what should you do? So when we look at this issue of the active shooter as it's presented today, we start to see some very interesting things. Give you some background on myself. This is my contact information, my website, the LinkedIn profile for myself, and you can see that I've done a lot over the years as far as the consulting area. I've worked with a number of companies, well over 100, to help them build programs for risk management, for infrastructure protection, for crisis management, business continuity, etc. Written 4 books, one of which is also published in Spanish. My latest book on protecting your business in a pandemic really focuses on not so much the medical issues, but on the business issues. And you can find the books on Amazon, other places on the internet. You could also find a lot of my articles on various journals and publications that are also on the internet. That gives you a little bit of a background for myself. The issue of this active shooter is an interesting one because we've seen a change, kind of a paradigm change in how people are viewing and considering actions with regards to what they should do if there's a situation of violence, if you will, in the workplace or in an area where they happen to be. The thing that I look at most with this is that active shooter is something you need to have a great awareness of, but realize it's not just someone who has a weapon, a gun. It could be someone who has a knife, who has just become violent in some way, shape, or form, and threatens or kind of pursues threats with other individuals in the workplace and also external to the workplace. So this paradigm is kind of an interesting one because we've seen an expansion of the definition of active shooter over the years. So the definition that now the U.S. Homeland Security provides is that an active shooter is an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a confined and populated area. In most cases, active shooters use firearms, and there's no pattern or method to their selection of victims. That's kind of a nice way of looking at things, but the reality is, in many respects, that you don't need to have a person with a gun, a firearm, to create this kind of mayhem. So when we begin to look at this, we begin to expand our understanding. In the U.S., the Occupational Safety and Health Administration had produced guidelines for workplace violence, and they looked at the typical profile of someone who would commit workplace violence, etc., and had put together kind of a nice profile that also was formed into some regulatory guidance. So a lot of organizations looked at putting together programs because they wanted to comply with the regulations to really address this issue of violence in the workplace. Well, the thing about violence is that we find it to be expanding, and it's not something that's unique to any one country or area. If you look at this slide, it's from The Economist, recent edition, that looked at the world's most murderous metropolises, homicides per 100,000, the 50 worst cities in 2015, or the latest available. And you can see that San Salvador ranks as pretty much number one, whereas in the United States, Baltimore and St. Louis are relatively low, but considering the breadth of the United States, they still rank higher than many of the cities. It's interesting, I come from the Chicago area, and there has been a lot of focus on Chicago and violence here. We've had over 1,100 shootings this year so far, and we're only 5 months into the year. The issue that we find that's kind of facing us is that it seems to be that Chicago appears to be one of the most violent cities in the world, when you realize that Baltimore, St. Louis are actually ahead of it because they're on this chart, not Chicago. You find also that New Orleans, Detroit, and San Francisco are ahead of Chicago. So when we look at this issue, we start to realize that it's very broadly based, and it's something that we should be concerned about and aware of, but not necessarily panicked about. So when we look at violence in the workplace, I look at a colleague who wrote a book by the name of Nassim Taleb. Nassim wrote actually 3 books. The first 2 that I'll talk about. Black Swan, which was his most successful book, and his book prior to that was called Fooled by Randomness. When he discusses a black swan event, he looks at 3 criteria. 1, that it's a very, very rare event. 2, that it has a big impact. And 3, that after the fact we kind of look at and rationalize that we saw this event coming. So he says in one of his books, the lack of knowledge when it comes to rare events with serious consequences is where we have a problem in analysis. What his perspective is that you simply cannot plan for random events. You can only respond to them. Well, when we look at active shooter, we look at violence in the workplace, we have to realize that these are truly random events. They're not something one can plan for. No one really can predict when someone's going to become violent or predict when something's going to happen specifically to them. So this is kind of an interesting perspective, because how do you prepare if you really can't predict or look at what to do in terms of protection? And it's important that we kind of comprehend this, because it becomes much more of a significant issue for us to maintain and keep our awareness of our surroundings and the areas that we're in, so that we can become much more attuned to some of the things going around us. So when I look at this from a continuity planning standpoint, we look at the broad base of potential crisis issues for organizations. And in continuity planning, what I want to achieve is a bit of resilience and also a bit of being able to maintain my organization's ability to conduct its business, whether it's government, private sector, etc. You want to be able to continue to do business under certain situations of uncertainty. So we have to first recognize uncertainty, and then realize that as much as we recognize uncertainty, we really can't prepare for what we just don't know, the unknown. And as I look at most crisis situations and most situations that evolve with the issue of active shooter, we see what we call a shape-shifting taking place. So we have normal operations, business as usual, and suddenly an event occurs, whether it's a natural disaster, a technological event, or a man-made event such as an active shooter. Things change shape. No longer are we doing our normal operations. Now we're reacting to and dealing with the situation with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of opacity. And opaqueness is a key in terms of our being able to understand how to deal with situations. So if you don't know what you don't know, how can you prepare for it? Well, on this slide, it's fairly clear that we have a situation. You've got an overturned glass with an ice cube and a puddle of water. Now, what can you tell me in terms of this? A lot about the ice cube, its shape, its color, its size. If you could feel it, you could tell how cold it is. You could see the texture of it. You could tell a lot about the puddle also in the same vein, because you can see the shape, you can see the size, you can touch it, you can see other things. What you can't tell me is two different perspectives. One, on the shape of the puddle, you can't tell me the shape of the ice cube that formed the puddle. And two, on the ice cube, you cannot tell me what the shape of the puddle it will form once it melts. So the question I ask here is, if you don't know what you don't know, how can you prepare for it? So our perspective is that you need to get the best knowledge possible and yet recognize a lot of uncertainty, a lot of what I'll call transparent vulnerabilities, and also a lot of things that you don't relate to the situation at hand, sort of the things you just don't see because they're there, but they're not there until they're pointed out to you. So when we look at this issue of active shooter, if you will, as a kind of a context here, we have to look at this in this perspective. When I have a risk, I have to recognize that this is a risk issue. What I want to do is move from the recognition of risk to an altered risk state, thereby protecting or buffering myself from the risk. Now, there's a bunch of things we can look at, and this slide is a bit challenging in some respects. You can do a linear process, moving from recognized to altered risk state. You have to look at the potential issues you face. If you take an action in the red arrow, that might be the right action, or that action could be the wrong action. In the same vein, if you take no action, that could be the right thing to do, or it could be the wrong thing to do. So we have to look at how we execute against risk and some of the things we use to buffer ourselves against risk. There are positive consequences, there are negative consequences. And on the bottom of this slide, I bring out 3 points. One, there are transparent vulnerabilities, things that you're so used to dealing with that you just don't see them as a vulnerability. Two, there are outliers, things that you don't see because you cannot directly relate them to the recognized risk you have. And then we have to look at all the variables, which range in the broadest sense from every perspective you can imagine to weather, people, all the things that are associated with a risk being realized. So this altering of the risk state is key to how we want to go about approaching this issue of an active shooter. When we look at concerns as far as human resources and legal concerns, in the U.S., OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has a general duty clause that you're supposed to provide a workplace that is protected and safe. We see that you can also look at other issues from a legal standpoint. Were you negligent in hiring this person? Was there negligence in supervising the individual? Was there negligence in terms of retention? ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, and the EEOC, Equal Opportunity issues come to base. Workers' compensation, wrongful death suit, other legal issues come to light when you have a situation like this. So a good set of policies and procedures and protocols is needed to address this issue. When we look at, again, the legal issue, there are some real interesting legal constructs that have to be looked at. One is the issue of constructive knowledge, which, as it says on the slide, if one by the exercise of reasonable care would have known a fact, he or she is deemed to have constructive knowledge of such fact, i.e. matters of public record. So is it a law or is it in terms of public record on the internet, in a newspaper, in a publication, etc., etc. Constructive notice such as the issuing of a regulatory guidance document or an ISO document, is something that's, as it says here, implied or imputed by law, as in the case of notice of documents which have been recorded with the appropriate registry of deeds, etc. So there's a constructive notice issue. Negligence, the omission to do something which a reasonable person, reasonable man as it says on the slide, guided by those ordinary considerations which ordinarily regulate human affairs, would do, or the doing of something which a reasonable and prudent person, man, would do. Kind of key issues there. And then you have the two issues of foreseeability and foreseeable risk, both legal constructs that are used to look at this issue of how well prepared or are you able to anticipate what's going on. So this whole issue comes into play with a lot of legal perspective. I mentioned nonlinearity, opacity, and reactivity. When we look at nonlinearity, as Nassim Taleb says, and as we look at the definition here, nonlinearity, evolution creates change. Collateral forces come into play. You have a uniqueness that's created by the way that evolution occurs. If you think of events, they evolve. Nonlinear evolution of events is a combination of reaction to the events as they take place. So I go back to my risk perspective. If you recognize a risk and you move towards an altered risk perspective, you are effectively dealing with a nonlinearity, because as you recognize it, others recognize it. As you take action, they take action. And as you have these actions suddenly intermingle, you start to have reactivity. So you have reactivity to the change that takes place. And then we have to look at consequences. Short-term consequences, immediate consequences, long-term lasting effects, and then those that are not readily apparent. So we have to really begin to look at this issue of opacity and not being able to clearly recognize some of the perspectives when we deal with kind of the issue of an active shooter. So when I look at this from a business continuity standpoint, and when I look at business continuity, you have to realize that it's the business and how it stays in business. So this could be a government, this could be a private industry. How do I stay in business? And generally speaking, we kind of look at these kind of issues. You have PR, public relations, crisis communications management, you have crisis management, you have recovery management, you have emergency response, business recovery, systems and information recovery, and a whole other series of kind of related plans. So if we look at the middle part of this graphic, you see that there is the term normal business operations. So this is the day-to-day. We're at work doing what we do. An event occurs. This is my first transition point that we have. You move to this transition point number one, which is an event occurs, you have an activation of your plans or an activation of your organization. You have reactive response, and you have what I call chaos control. We want to move to response mitigation and termination as quickly as possible. And the problem we have is that once we're in the transition point number one, this reactive response, we find that all the plans and everything that we've developed are subject to what I'll call my transition point number two, which is unplanned disruption. The things that we haven't planned for, or the things that are not in our plans that are occurring that cause an unplanned disruption. Now the interesting part about it is that transition point number two and transition point number one can put us into a loop. What we want to do is move very quickly out of unplanned disruption to transition point number three, which is planned disruption. This is the stuff that my plan addresses. So this is the stuff that the workplace violence program, all the other things that I have put in place begin to address. And that leads us into this kind of response mitigation and termination, reentry, restoration, and resumption. And the resumption is of business in an altered state, if you will. And then resumption to transition to a normal or new normal operation. And then the last phase, which is termination, my fourth transition point, where we go back to business in the new normal sense. So this is critical that we understand these things, because when we get into this reentry, restoration, and resumption phase, because of the fact that you've had an active shooter, a place that's been disturbed by violence in some way, shape, or form, you find that there are a bunch of things that take precedence. If it's a crime scene, the civil authorities take charge. In the U.S., you may have the FBI, you may have the Secret Service, you may have the local police, the state police, the other government entities, Homeland Security, etc., that are involved. When an event is declared a crime scene, you suddenly are precluded from being able to access that area or that part of your organization. And that challenges us in a lot of respects, because how do I stay in business when these things are happening and have no control over them? So when we look at this process, we have to look at several things. With regards to mitigation, I want to have a set of policies, plans, and procedures. I want to do a risk assessment, a constant kind of process, if you will, not just a one-off risk assessment that looks at the current situation and doesn't go beyond. So a constant process of active analysis. I want to get executive buy-in. Critical, because the program has to be supported. When I get into the preparedness area, I want to look at physical security, training, especially for the general worker population, training to understand and to be aware, not training that deals with other things. So understanding and awareness. Team development for the crisis team. I want to go through and build their capabilities to work together as a crisis team. I want to do exercises and drills, simulations. What would you do if? How do I deal with this situation? When I look at recovery, I want to look at the psychology aspect, first aid and trauma, as far as the management of those issues. How do I investigate this, and how do I keep my business in business, if you will, business continuity aspect? And then from the response perspective, threat assessment, threat management, how do I notify and communicate, and what actions from an emergency standpoint should people take, and how do I control those, or how do I give guidance to those? When we look at this issue, and I think it's critical we understand this, a situation of violence in a workplace or violence in an area that you're in is all about survivability. It's about being able to survive the event. So guidance that's been put out by the U.S. government, by the military, by other folks, is that we have three possible things we can do. First one, run and escape. If that's possible, do it. The second one, hide if escape is not possible. And the last one, which unfortunately people have a tendency to look at more so than run, hide, and escape, is fight. But they say it here only as a last resort. So when you look at that last resort, realize a number of things. One, you have to be able to look at how I make a decision. What are the uncontrollable inputs I'm faced with? So my goal in a situation with an active shooter is fairly simple. I want to survive. I have to look at what my options are, what my potential choices are, options. Do I run and hide, or do I just run and escape? What choices do I have? Recognize the interactions, and understand these interactions, take some action, realize my goal, survivability, and then begin to redefine goals and objectives. So it's a very simple loop, which I call the ODA Loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. Really simple things. Look at what's going on, orient yourself. What should I do? Run and hide, or escape, or am I cornered and do I have to fight? Decide very quickly, and then you have to act very quickly. Now, the challenge is acting, and this is critical in a lot of respects. The good practices, things that are put forth as far as looking at dealing with an active shooter. One, be aware of your environment, any possible dangers that you're faced with. Take note of the nearest exits to the facility you're in. If you're in an office, stay there and secure the door, hide under the desk somewhere. If you're in a hallway, get to a room with a secure door. As a last resort, attempt to take the active shooter down. Now, this is really a challenge, because if we think about this, we're focused on the TV aspect. Realize if a person has a gun and you're a distance away from them, they have a distinct advantage. Unless you can surprise them in some way, shape, or form and be close enough to disable them, you should run and escape or hide. In the U.S., we use the 911 as a emergency call system. In various other countries, you may have other numbers, but you should call for support or for police as soon as possible, or when it's safe to do so, as it said. I've used over the years the following for a number of purposes. When I work with companies in terms of crisis management, business continuity, workplace violence, etc., this little form seems to have a very, very solid basis. It's called IPAC, and the acronym stands for Identify, Protect, Alert, and Communicate. On the front of the card, it's shown on the left-hand side, and on the back here, what we do is just generally find for medical emergencies, security control, building operations, or any type of hotline, what are the key numbers you should call? What kind of things, if you call a police or fire department, their number, and how you should report an event. So you give your name, your location, your callback number, the nature of the event, the severity of the event, the estimate of casualties, access points, and then the status of initial response. Those are all nice to know. In a crisis situation where you're under pressure, this helps to give you some kind of semblance of guidance so that you can actually feel a little bit more comfortable in using this. So now my challenge to you is very simply this. First, what are you going to do with the information that's been provided within your organization, possibly external to your organization? How are you going to make things happen so that your organization's better able to look at this issue of violence? And how do you actionize what you've heard? So this is really three challenge areas, because it's unfortunate, but we're seeing more and more violence and the expansion of violence in a lot of different areas. So schools, malls, all kinds of other places where people gather are suddenly subject to potential violence, which has a tendency to cause people. Said, and I think this is kind of, we look at planning, we look at strategy, and we look at developing a plan that we hope is as comprehensive as possible, and we hope that will work as it's written. However beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. This is critical. The results I look is, are we training our people? Do they have a good basis of understanding? Do we have the plans, procedures, and protocols in place? And how effective are we? Because we needed to validate what we've planned for. So do we do drills and exercises? How do we do these things? Okay, with that, I'm going to conclude the formal portion of the presentation. I'll open it up to questions from the audience here. So I'll turn it back over to our
Susanna.
Moderator.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. No worries. Thank you very much, Mr. Sikich, for this presentation. We will go ahead and take some time for questions now. So the first question is, why do you think that active shooter situations are more common in U.S. rather than in other countries around the world?
I think it's probably, in one respect, more common in the U.S. because we have more media coverage of these types of events. Our media has a tendency to focus on these type of issues, and in order to, if you will, sell space and get an audience on TV. The other aspect is, I think that in the U.S., people's expectations are very short-term, and when they're not immediately gratified, we have a tendency to get a little bit, how would I put it? I don't want to say a little bit violent. We just get very impatient in a lot of respects. I think in the other parts of the world, we see less of the kind of actions we see in the U.S., but I think we're starting to see this in terms of a migration towards violence. So, you know, you've got a lot in the Middle East. You're starting to see in Europe some of the things that are happening. In Asia and in Eastern Europe, Soviet, or excuse me, the Russian Federation, no longer Soviet Union, you don't hear a lot. There's a little bit more restrictiveness with regards to the news media. So those challenges face us with that. So you may see more from the U.S. in that regard.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, what is the difference between a terrorist attack and an active shooter?
That's an interesting point, because when I looked at the current OSHA perspective, they used to define active shooter in like 4 categories. And what they've now done with Homeland Security is start to expand into a 5th category, which is the focus on terrorism. So the difference between an active shooting situation and a terrorist situation is a very thin line, and today it's more and more difficult to determine. So the actions that we start to see is that people are beginning to focus on, the profile of the perpetrator, if you will. Have they been involved with any known or subversive groups? A very delicate issue, because it's as I said, a very thin line between workplace violence from the standpoint of somebody coming in and doing something that's violent in the workplace versus a terrorist coming in and intentionally trying to disrupt for the purpose of terrorism. Very difficult to define in a lot of respects, but it is a category that we're starting to see more focus on, because we're starting to look at a broader definition of these issues.
Thank you. The next question is, how often should a company have a active shooter training?
I would say that it depends on the organization, and I say that in this regard. Generally speaking, most organizations do quarterly exercises of their continuity plans or emergency plans. Those have a tendency to be focused more on the business operation than on the issue of an active shooter. You may do a big annual exercise that involves a broader basis of the company. I would say with an active shooter situation that it's incumbent upon the security department to kind of bring forth this issue with people who are doing business continuity, who are doing crisis management, and bring it in as part of a scenario planning perspective. So change up in terms of the exercise perspective. Initially, for a company that's just getting involved, I would say these drills are kind of effective on a monthly basis. And then after a period of time, maybe on a quarterly basis. But having a kind of constant ability to keep this issue in terms of front and center in person's mind is critical. So not just drills and exercises, but periodic little newsletter, blog type things that can be done internally to send out to the organization that keeps that awareness built up. Very critical in a lot of respects.
Thank you. The next question is, in case we recognize or personally know the active shooter, is it a good idea to try to talk to him?
Prior to him starting to shoot, yes, probably it is. When he starts to become violent, I follow the rule: run and run fast, or hide and hopefully not be seen. The unpredictability of a person who has become violent is something that you just don't want to deal with on a basis where you have uncertainty. I think that's critical for us to understand. So prior to, yes, if you see some things, perhaps having some consultation with the individual, always not by yourself, but with someone else to be there. But also, in the event that that person does become violent, you want to stay as far away as possible and let professionals come in to deal with the situation. So your security force, the police force, and any kind of external entity, you don't want to put yourself at risk.
Thank you. And the last question for today is, according to your experience, have there been any active shooter situations that, due to good knowledge of the people involved, have ended with no fatalities?
I think that's a very, very excellent question. To my knowledge, I would have to say, no, I have not any knowledge of a non-fatality situation. Um, prior, partially because when you think of active shooter, you think of immediately someone as a casualty. Now, casualties and fatalities may be an area where we can differentiate. There have been situations where you've had people injured, a casualty, and no fatalities, but in general, an active shooter, someone with a gun or a knife or someone with a bomb is kind of bent on destruction in some way, shape, or form. So the reality is that a lot of things that are non-fatality related don't necessarily get reported very well. And I would say that it would be a great Google search to look into that issue, and actually it might be an interesting article to write to look at the results of these kind of situations. How many situations resulted in maybe some minor injuries and casualties versus fatalities? And it would go back, I think, to a lot of the being prepared and being aware of your surroundings and being prepared to act quickly to do something to protect yourself.
Mr. Sikich, I would like to thank you once again for this presentation. It was our honor having you as a presenter. Yeah, I would also like to thank all the attendees for taking the time out of their busy schedule to join us. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. We received all of your questions, and because the time is limited, we will answer to your questions individually by email. Also, don't forget to check PCB's webinar schedule on our website, pcb.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and be updated with our weekly webinars. Until next Friday, have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye.